Thank you, Professor Aaron, and all the panelists for wonderful sharing and discussion. And here comes the last session in our morning. I'd like to invite Professor James Williams from George Washington University to moderate the next section, Competence-Based Reforms and Disciplinary Content, some lessons from Europe and the Americas. Please, Professor.
Thank you. So this is the session, the last session before lunch. And so if this were my class, I would ask everyone to take a deep breath. And then another one. All right, and maybe to stretch just a little bit. Right. Not very professional, but probably a good idea. Good. Well, thank you. My name is James Williams. I'm from George Washington and a co-convener of NISEM, which has been an honor and a privilege to work with. I thank Venus and the ministry and all of the people who've made this conference possible. It's going to become one that I look forward to every year, I hope, and next year in Hanoi. This session is entitled Competence-Based Reforms and Disciplinary Content, Some Lessons from Europe and the Americas. And I think the last session near the end, a couple of the comments related to silos and disciplinary content. And I think that's true. We're talking about competencies, disciplinary content reform. I don't know that we will talk about play during this session, maybe. That's a joke, but maybe it didn't come across as a joke. Maybe I shouldn't joke. This is Dr. Catherine Anderson-Levitt is going to present in just a moment. I have to confess, she's one of my academic heroes. I have long worshipped the articles she writes, and I find her insight, perhaps because I have anthropological proclivities myself, but I find her way of looking at things very, very helpful. And one of the things that's most helpful about it is that she tends to move beyond binaries. And so her case studies, they're not of Asia, but they are of the cultural West, at least. And it's nice because they're different from each other, the different cases, and it gets us away from what might become an East-West kind of binary. I think it's important to understand major differences, of course, perhaps civilizational differences, if we believe that, but it's also important to look at the particulars and the nuances and the individuality of particular places, which may or may not be defined by country, but in some cases they are. And so her perspective brings us a rich understanding of that. So I'm not going to say too much more because the point is not for me to talk, but it should be quite good. We'll have about 25 minutes of her presentation, give or take, and then we have 3 discussants, and we'll say a bit about them before the discussion, and then we will hopefully have time for discussion and question and answer with the larger group. And so Dr. Levitt is Professor Emerita of Anthropology at the University of Michigan, Dearborn, but she also taught at UCLA's Department of Education from 2011 to 19. She is an anthropologist, was editor of Anthropology and Education Quarterly, presently co-editor of Comparative Education Review. She does ethnographic research and has carried out research on education in France, Guinea, and the United States, particularly focused on teachers, teacher education, reading instruction, and the global flow of educational reform. So let me turn it over to Dr. Anderson-Levitt.
Thank you, Jim.
Oh, good. There she is.
And I'm going to try sharing my screen with my slides. And is that working? Are you seeing the slide all right? Yes?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Thanks so much for the opportunity to be here to learn from everyone's work and try to pick up a little bit on the energy of those of you who are thinking and working so hard to improve education. This paper maybe will be a little bit different. It's going to focus on meanings of competency-based reform in 3 countries, in 3 cases, asking how differences in these meanings matter. I'm going to look at cases from France, Russia, and Uruguay. But I'm drawing not on my own research here, but on the research of colleagues. So the French research on the reform comes from Pierre Clément, and we also are lucky to have work on teachers' implementation by Bautier and Bonegri with Clément. From Russia, the research has been done by Elena Aidarova, also an anthropologist like me. And from Uruguay, the research was reported by Eloisa Bordoli. And the articles I'm drawing on appear in these 2 issues, which were co-edited by me and other colleagues on competency-based reform. Whoops, excuse me. As you have commented already, the words themselves, the translations themselves, the meanings of competency vary. So in French, for example, the word compétence is similar to English, although often it gets translated just as skill, but in fact it means skills plus dispositions, knowing how, but also being ready to do something. My colleagues from Sweden point out that in Swedish reforms, this word is used, förmågor, and literally means abilities in the sense of qualities developed over time within specific subjects. So that changes the connotation a certain amount. In Uruguay and Spanish, this is the word used, the explanation used in their reform, to think and to act within complexity. All right, so pretty close to French ideas. In the Russian case, Dr. Aidarova says that they actually borrowed the word directly from English, leading to a fair amount of confusion and bewilderment amongst educators who said, well, why not use the terms we're already used to using, which they abbreviate as ZUN, standing for knowledge, skills, and abilities. So that is background, but in fact, what I want to focus on, is the meaning of entire reforms as they have been put into operation, and in particular, how they address tensions or oppositions between disciplinary knowledge and transversal competencies. So again, these are the 3 cases, all reforms that were initiated formally in close to the same time period, so relatively recently. So let me take you through each of the reforms first, and then I will talk about 3 issues or questions or tensions that arise in looking at these reforms. And then I will talk about a couple of the larger questions that arise at the end. So the case of France, in 2005, the French Parliament, not just the Ministry of Education, but the Parliament enacted a reform to establish le socle commun, the common core, with competencies as learning goals, rather to my surprise, since France is famous for being interested in disciplinary-based education. But this reform was passed because of an unusual alliance of different supporters. On the one hand, many conservative educators supported the reform because they saw it as supporting development of jobs and the economy, and also because it would make assessment easier for public management. But there were also certain progressives who supported this reform. And when I say progressives, I mean educators who supported active learning and learner-centered instruction. So in this case, I'm going to particularly take a look at what the logic was behind these progressive educators in supporting competency-based reform. In the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Education enacted new federal standards for elementary and secondary schools in a series of reforms from 2011 to 2014. These reforms were shaped by a very small network of experts, some of whom had one foot in the international realm, having worked for the World Bank and so on. And when I say a small network, I mean only 6 or 7 people to whom Idarova managed to get access. And she actually spent a lot of time observing their work and interviewing them. The reform that these experts basically designed and saw put into place was strongly opposed by teacher educators. And we're going to come back to some of those issues at the end. In the case, and I will focus especially on the perspective of the experts in this case. In Uruguay, meanwhile, the Ministry of Education, inspired by the OECD, proposed a new competency-based curriculum framework in 2016. This was strongly opposed by teachers who have actually a formal teachers' assembly as a piece of government. And the teachers opposed this framework partly because just a few years previously, they had been involved in helping to design a discipline-based curriculum. They also were concerned with the plan to have compensatory programs as part of the reform. In other words, there would be a different curriculum for low achieving students, which basically meant the urban poor and the rural poor. And so shifting Uruguay's homogeneous curriculum into a 2-tier system. And in this case, I'll focus on the teacher's perspective. These are the 3 tensions which I want to take a look at in turn. Starting with the question, who values disciplinary knowledge in particular, who values competencies in particular in these cases? Looking first at the case of France and focusing on these progressives, they had a perspective that you might find interesting. They felt very strongly that disciplinary-based education was dead knowledge. They referred to it as scholasticism, so referring back to sort of French intellectual history. They didn't like it because they considered that teaching the disciplines was really teaching arbitrary knowledge learned only because it had been favored by the upper classes. And they felt it was not relevant to many of the pupils, particularly working class and children of former immigrants. They wanted to, they hoped that a competency-based curriculum would enable a freer education and in fact, free pupils so that they could engage in more active learning and more meaningful. And they assumed, I think, that this kind of engagement would lead to deeper learning. The Russian experts, in contrast, felt that disciplinary knowledge was much more valuable than competencies, even though they knew that the World Bank was pushing the competencies. But once within their own enclave, this was the perspective that they developed and were able to put across. They felt that disciplinary knowledge was good for the elite and leading to the possibility to develop theoretical knowledge, as they said. the competencies they thought were good enough for the masses, for what one expert referred to as the drunk side of town. The third case, Uruguay, the teachers clearly, because they had just participated in helping to develop a disciplinary-based curriculum, favored disciplinary knowledge as good for all people, and actually explicitly critiqued in interviews competencies as being borrowed from, promoted by OECD and World Bank, but they felt not appropriate for Uruguay. So sorry. So in taking those three perspectives together, then we had the French progressives favoring competencies, our focus of these cases in Uruguay and Russia favoring disciplinary-based research, but on the other hand, the teachers in Uruguay and the French progressives agreeing with one another in that the curriculum should be the same for all, whatever the curriculum actually was. And the Russian experts, in contrast, working to take what had been a homogeneous Soviet education system, the same for all, and converting it into a two-tiered system. Second issue now is what I will refer to as cognitive versus personal competencies. And this is my interpretation of the cases that we are looking at. As I said, the Russian experts liked disciplinary focused curriculum for elite students because they said that it leads to theoretical knowledge. What did they mean? They explained that, for example, in the case of history, students who learn to see how historical knowledge is produced and how facts can have multiple interpretations are then prepared to shape interpretations themselves. That's what they said. Now, my interpretation, shifting into a perspective of competencies, is that they were saying deep understanding of history should also lead you to be able to analyze, to do critical thinking, and even to become an autonomous thinker. So you could say that they were arguing that deep disciplinary study leads to the development of competencies. And specifically, these are cognitive competencies. And I say cognitive because when the Russians talked about competencies for the masses, for the rest of students, they said, well, that's a whole different category. They thought of competencies in terms of what they referred to as personal competencies. And they had a long list that basically focused on high morals, responsibility, respect for traditional family values. So in the context of everything that has been said so far, this may look very good, but Aidorova says that really what they were talking about was socializing working class students to become compliant workers and compliant citizens with these kinds of competencies. So let's see if I'm on the right place. So the summary of the Russian expert perspective is, yes, we favor disciplinary knowledge, but in fact, it will lead to, they didn't say it this way, but my interpretation is it will lead to cognitive competencies for elite students. But meanwhile, we're going to teach personal competencies for the masses. So that's the basis of the two-tiered system they were developing. Yes. Sorry. The third distinction that I want to make in meanings of competencies comes from Bernard Rey, and it's the distinction between complex and simple competencies. And it comes up because we have this opportunity to compare the reform in France with actual implementation as observed in a number of classrooms in France by ethnographers Bautier and Bonnery. They said when they looked at their work on what was actually going on in classrooms, they found that it was important to be able to distinguish between complex and simple competencies. Complex competencies are, again, what we were talking about before, really high-level thinking, higher order thinking, being able to respond to novel situations by mobilizing information, know-how, and attitudes. That's a typical French type of definition. An example from the actual curriculum that was implemented in 2005, this is one competency within that curriculum framework. Students should be able to adapt their writing to the person addressed and the effect they wish to create. So you can see what a complicated activity that should be for say a lower secondary student trying to shape a composition and keeping in term audience and intended effect. A simple competency, in contrast, means a fairly predictable step-by-step procedure, such as multiplication or conjugating a verb. What the ethnographers witnessed in classrooms in France was that, yes, indeed, in spite of controversies, teachers were attempting to ask students to achieve complex competencies. For example, the example that they analyze is one of the competencies within the curriculum is know how to analyze a document. And by the way, notice how the cognitive orientation, whereas the group has been talking a lot about social and emotional skills, I get the sense that a lot of the reform in France emphasized the cognitive higher order thinking. So knowing how to analyze a document requires a certain kind of sophisticated perspective to make sense of the document. And the examples that they looked at in their research were, for example, reading a table in science class or reading a table in French class. Sorry. Indeed, so this task was asked of both high achieving and low achieving pupils, but amongst low achieving pupils in classrooms observed, which mostly in working class schools, the pupils were mystified, confused about how to begin analyzing tables. And the researchers think, well, that's because there's a lot of implicit knowledge that you have to draw on in order to make sense of a table. You really, and it's going to be variable depending on the purpose of the author who developed the table, the discipline involved, and so on. But none of that is stated up front. So the students are mystified, and the teachers attempt to move the lesson along and to give them help, to instruct them by sharing dispositifs pédagogiques, teaching tools. Here is an example that can be found on the internet of the kind of tool that a teacher might reach for. This teaching tool is called How to Read a Table. And to look at it a little more closely, here's the top, and it illustrates how to read a table with this example. Here is a table comparing certain animals as a function of their attributes. Animals: dog, cat, human, bees, attributes: 6 legs, fur, claws, and so on. And if we look further down the table, there are steps proposed to the students about how to do this analysis. And to show you in simpler text, the steps are: first, read the title of the table, which provides information on the items to compare and the criteria by which they are compared. Number 2, read the information at the intersection of the item with the criterion that you wish to analyze. For example, if you want to know if a cat has fur, look at the row for the criterion fur. I can just imagine a student saying, if I want to know if a cat has fur, I will look at a cat in my backyard. But anyway, this is the step proposed. And also, there is a third step added. If the table contains numbers, check the units of measurement. So what was going on here? That sort of three-step process would actually work for some tables. And in fact, the ethnographers did witness this particular class looked at a science table that did fit those criteria, and the steps would have worked pretty well. However, you have to notice that what was going on with the addition of that teaching tool was the teachers, or the tool itself, were translating a complex competency, reading a table, into a simple procedural competency, step by step. In addition, the simple procedure did not work for all tables. So you had to have some kind of meta knowledge about tables. For example, this same class looked at a table when they were studying French language and literature, and it didn't, the steps would not work. This table says, classify words drawn from Beauty and the Beast. And you're asked to classify by nouns, adjectives, verbs, and adverbs. What you have here are 4 lists in the columns, and it does not make any sense to compare across the rows. So the procedure doesn't work. You need some larger context. What the students were not getting was that larger understanding of the various ways you might have to approach the task of analyzing a text, in this case, making sense of a table, depending on the discipline, the purpose, and so on. So in the French case, what we see is a gap between the ideal and actual practice. In other words, a problem with implementation, as we have been discussing earlier today, not for lack of interest or good intention on the part of the teachers, but just because they're trying to adapt to their students, so that you end up with an ideal of a same curriculum for everyone, which is higher order thinking. But in practice, you're seeing in at least some classrooms complex competencies for elite students, which were witnessed in practice, and simplistic procedural competencies in working class schools. The overall picture then is complicated, more complicated yet when we look at all these issues. First of all, again, you have differences in whether people favor competencies or favor disciplinary knowledge. Secondly, there is this distinction of personal competencies as opposed to cognitive competencies, at least made by the Russians, but I've argued that at least in the French case as well, there was probably an emphasis on cognitive. Thirdly, you have the distinction between a goal of a uniform curriculum for all, or a 2-tier tracked curriculum. And then finally, we had the contrast between ideal and actual practice, which put the French case also into the category of 2-tiered teaching. So one other point. These are not cross-national differences, right? Because if you recall, the teachers in Uruguay disagreed with their own Ministry of Education. The Russian experts disagreed with schools of teacher education. And, excuse me, in the French case, although these progressives were educators themselves, they disagreed with some of their colleagues. The entire secondary teachers union was completely against this particular reform. And I didn't mention, but in fact, in the case of France, this reform did ultimately not work out so well. And when a new government came in 2012, it was replaced with a different competency-based reform. So many questions could be raised. And I think these are the sorts of questions that we've all, some of which have already come up in discussion, and I think are probably on the minds of people who are developing curriculum reforms or thinking about putting competencies into textbooks. I'm going to mention just two because we are running out of time. First, this question of whether competencies, or at least cognitive competencies, require you to use prior knowledge. This is an argument that has been made by British researchers, Basil Bernstein and Michael Young. And they talk about the implicit expectations, again, behind the tasks that students are being given without enough explicit instruction. I do wonder if prior knowledge is required. To what extent does it need to be disciplinary knowledge? Do you need to send the students back to the textbooks, or is it possible to take alternative routes? Perhaps this is even what those progressive educators had in mind. Might teachers help pupils draw on knowledge from elders in their community or whatever that would provide an alternative background? But whatever, if you take that approach, of course, it requires a great deal of work and planning on the teacher's part. Here's an example. If you wanted to teach cross-ethnic collaboration or do peace education, is it necessary for the pupils first to have a good understanding and a balanced understanding of local history, religious differences, cultural differences, and so on? And if so, do you have to send them back to the textbooks for that knowledge, or might they be able to glean that knowledge from community members? And the last point that I want to leave thinking about, and this came up very much in the prior discussion, is what is the role of teachers in developing curriculum and putting it into practice? We saw these tensions between teachers and reformers in all three cases. And I would make the argument that we did talk about the need to educate teachers and prepare them to teach, but educating after the fact may not be enough. Teachers, in any case, we have to understand, as some of the prior speakers said, that teachers are the ultimate designers of curriculum as it's actually implemented in the classroom, when they figure out what to do with it in their classes. And so they are going to teach it as it makes sense to them, as it aligns with their values, and as it can be made to work under the conditions in which they actually teach. So that is all. And again, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine. All right. So we have, thank you for an interesting, very interesting, provocative presentation. And again, looking not only across countries, but as you say, within them, for different philosophies and ways of thinking about competencies and the extent to which it's based on discipline or other bases. I'd like to introduce the three panelists or discussants very quickly, and then allow each of them a few minutes to comment, and then we can open it up for discussion across the panel and Q&A from those who are listening. Going in order of the program, Professor Yuto Kitamura is a professor at the Graduate School of Education, University of Tokyo. He received his PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles. So there's a commonality there. He's worked at UNESCO, education sector, taught at Nagoya University, Sophia University. He was a Fulbright scholar at George Washington, where I met and got to know him, visiting professor at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh. He is special advisor to the rector of the Royal University of Phnom Penh in Cambodia, and a member of the Board of Education at the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, along with a number of other honorary positions and service positions, a well-known colleague in Japan and a dear colleague and friend. Professor Orie Sasaki is Associate Professor at the Faculty of Education, Kaiichi University, one of the leading teacher training universities in Japan. She received her PhD from the University of Tokyo. She's worked in international cooperation and development as an educational consultant before moving to research. And her current research interest is teacher education and its evaluation and promoting education for sustainable development is a particular interest of hers. And then last and certainly not least, Dr., and forgive my pronunciation if I get this wrong, Dr. Lei Dong Fong has been working in the education sector for more than 35 years. His main research interest is education policy and analysis, especially in higher education. He's taken part in various education reform projects, notably the Strategic Plan for Education 2011 to 2020, redesign of the education system structure in the Vietnam qualifications framework. In addition to policy issues, Dr. Fong has worked in various studies related to system development and reform, connections between different levels of education and learning pathways for students at different levels. So let me call on, again, going in order of the program, Dr. Kitamura.
Okay, Jim-san, thank you very much for introducing me. As he kindly introduced me, I've been working in the field of comparative education and looking at the education policy in the countries in the Mekong region, particularly Cambodia, but also Vietnam and Laos. And I'm so honored to be here, and I really like to thank Vietnam BINES and also NISM to invite us to take part in this very important conference. And then thank you very much, Professor Anderson Levitt, for such inspiring and wondering presentations. And I really learned quite a lot from your presentations, and I just like to make brief comments on that. By the way, I finished my PhD at UCLA in 2000, so slightly before you taught there. So anyway, let me start. I think you, following the two sessions in the morning, I think you have also discussed about the meanings of the competencies in deeper and more concrete ways to refer to the three countries. And then it is very interesting to see that there seems to be some gaps between what is intended or what is ideal and also what is actually practiced. This is also the issue we discussed in the previous sessions. And what is intended in the curriculum is not actually practiced in the classrooms, but there seems to be various reasons. It's not only because of the design of the curriculum, but also the disagreement between the policy and the teachers, or even among the teachers, those conservatives and the progressives, and so on and so forth. So there seems to be certain gaps between. And also, I found very interesting about these three country cases. And I'm just wondering, how much context of the countries influence to the different phenomena you observed from the different case studies. This is again also discussed in the previous sessions, how country context influence to the situation in the school education and also the curriculum. I mean, different level of economic development and also political situations in three countries, how these can influence to the different approaches you could observe from the different cases. That needs to be explored further. For instance, thinking of the situation with Southeast Asia, ASEAN. Vietnam is probably typical because it's not, Vietnam may consider themselves still developing countries, but at the same time, their economy has been growing so rapidly these days. And then there seems to be a rapid change of the mode of industries in the society, and then the needs and demands of the labor market have been changing. So there seem to be more and more needs and demands for the human resources who have more transversal competencies. However, at the same time, much of the labor market still also expect the people to have basic knowledge and skills as well, because there are also the labor-intensive industries still playing important roles in the Vietnamese economy. So what can be the balance between the disciplinary knowledge and transversal competencies are challenges for the country like Vietnam and also some other Southeast Asian countries, because you want to produce human resources to respond to the needs and demands of the labor markets. However, labor market has been changing so dramatically. So that's the one question I come up with based on your presentations. And then last point I would like to make is that almost the end of your presentation, you mentioned about how to teach peace or, for instance, cross-ethnic collaborations. And I have done a survey to more than 2,000 students in Yokohama City, Japan last year, in order to understand how the ESD, Education for Sustainable Development, have been influencing to the perceptions of students, and also how teachers have been teaching, doing the ESD in the classrooms, in the schools. And based on our survey data of the more than 2,000 students and nearly 400 teachers, we have identified that students and teachers are much more comfortable to learn or teach about the things surrounding them in their daily life. So, regarding the recycling of the trash and garbages, or try to reduce the food wastages, these are, the issues, problems we observe in daily life so easily. Then these things you can teach so easily. However, the global challenges, for instance, climate change, biodiversity, refugees, conflict, and so on and so forth. I mean, these are only the textbook knowledge teachers are teaching and then students are studying. So there seems to be the gaps between the experiences they have and the textbook knowledges. And then teachers and students are struggling to really fully understand what these actually means with the textbook knowledges. So how we can really change this? I mean, that's probably the challenge, not only Japan, but also many other countries, to promote this type of teaching and learning of the transversal competencies. So I just would like to share some of our research findings to think as a kind of a fruit of thoughts for us. But anyway, your presentation really inspired me, so I have more comments, but I should stop here. And then I really look forward to listening other discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jim, you need to unmute.
Oh.
Jim-san, you are muted.
So shall I share my comment?
Yeah, I think so. You can.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Anderson Levitt, for your wonderful presentation. I was also very much inspired by the comparison of 3 countries. I personally visited France and did field work there 3 times. So, and I think French case is very similar to Japanese case. And let me share some of Japanese experience about this competency-based curriculum reform first. As a result of the curriculum reform in Japan, a new course of study was enacted in 2017 for elementary and junior high schools, and then now also for high schools from this year. So along with this, the practice of teaching and the contents of textbooks has been also changing. And but the characteristics of the curriculum guidelines in Japan is that it's only the content standard. It doesn't include assessment. So so that's why we have some teachers struggle with the assessment, how to assess pupils and students' progress. And so in Japan, researchers discuss that we have mainly two main programs facing this curriculum reform. First one, in TALIS of OECD survey, Japanese teachers has the longest working hours among the participating countries. So they don't have enough time and also the materials to practice this new curriculum reform. And also, we are still under reform of the university entrance exam. So we are trying to measure competencies for the entrance examination to for the universities, but still we still face troubles. So sharing these Japanese experience, I would like to ask you two questions. First of all, for the countries like in Japan, which we don't have standards for assessment in this new curriculum competency-based reform, how can we maybe this is this also one of the element which defines how the competency is understood? You know, yeah, you have compared 3 countries, and I don't know if in their national curriculum the assessment is included or not, but it is standard for assessment is also one element to for the understanding of the competencies in each countries. And secondly, we still have very strong selection system, you know, through entrance examination to universities in Japan. And I think that's also the same case in most of the East Asian countries. And is this the selection system for elites can be also the one of the influence, can it influence to the understanding of competencies, interpretation of competencies? Thank you for listening to my points.
Okay, very interesting. And I think I pick up 3 points. How to assess these skills, especially in the absence of guidance. The influence of a very strong selection system, and perhaps the idea of test taking as a competence. I have to think about that. Maybe we can come back to those in a moment, if you don't mind, Catherine, and let our last discussant make his points. Yes, Dr. Le Dong Kwong.
Yep. Có nghe được chưa nhỉ? Okay. Hi, it's James. First of all, I would like to thank Catherine for the very comprehensive presentation. And because my background was comparative education, I do have great interest on looking at how you see things. And I have to comment on this, that those the 3 countries you were mentioning are quite far away from Vietnam, but Vietnam is is somehow falling in between, you know, because due to the historical development, Vietnam has inherited a lot of the French traditional schooling. And until now, you know, the schooling in Vietnam still have a lot of things we have seen in 100 years ago.
Mhm.
And therefore, I understand the discussion between the teachers and administrators in France, where they want to have this is subject-based teaching or like competency-based teaching, you know. And in our very recent school reform 2018, we were talking also about competency-based, but finally it came out as competency developing curriculum, you know. I think it's a smart solution to move from content-based into competency, but they are not quite sure about competency-based education, so they talk about competency developing education, you know. And also because here in Vietnam we have the national curriculum, and then school can have their own part in developing or like customize the school curriculum. But the national curriculum is very much richer. It has attachment with standards, with content requirements, things like that. And nowadays, a lot of teachers are wondering how they can implement the new school curriculum. Because competencies is also something very new to the Vietnamese education system. Those we have been discussing that for the last 20 years, and mostly also due to the influence by World Bank support. You know, Catherine has mentioned both in Russia, in Uruguay, the World Bank has influence on this or like promoting this, and also in Vietnam. But the thing is, we don't have the distinction between different levels of competencies, the macro level or micro level, like you have mentioned, complex or simple competencies. And teachers are wondering how they should do it, you know, and therefore they are coming almost exactly to the French way, you know, they're developing or the teaching complex competencies to the more advanced students, and they use simple competency teaching to the less advanced students. But that comes to the contradiction, you know, because I still remember the day I was in schools. Unfortunately, it was 40 years ago. I wasn't very good at all subjects because everybody was, every teacher was, wow, you know things, but you didn't know everything, you know? And those teachers are teaching the new teachers to teach the same way as they were teaching 50, 40 years ago. And that's why when we want the new teachers to look at how they teach competencies, they will be wondering, wow, I was been taught to teach subject matters, and now I have to think about competencies, which even my professor didn't know, you know. And one more thing in terms of competencies is in Vietnamese language, we talk about competencies as a combination of knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And some professor was insisting on having, if you want to name something as competencies, you have to name every component of that competency before you can talk about competency. I have been like discussing with those professors for the last 10 years, and I have not been able to convince them to change their mind, you know. But they have strong influence on the teacher education, on the school curriculum development. And I do think the school teachers will have problems with doing the new curriculum. But because as James has mentioned, I have been looking more towards the transition between school and universities. Here in Vietnam, the university sector is moving very fast toward competencies because that is a place where students will learn on how to fit into the labor market. And university professors do see they should bring the students in like skills or like masteries before they can be good in the very competitive labor market. While in the school, still very much subject matters based education. And therefore, we see the problem that in the after secondary schools, especially those who are not advancing to upper secondary, they have to enter the vocational schools or they have to go into labor market themselves. They didn't have necessary hard and soft skills, you know, because they have been taught about math, about biology, about chemistry, but they don't know how to use that in the real life. And they don't have the what we are talking about today, about transversal competencies, but I prefer to talk about soft skills. They don't know how to work in teams, on how to communicate what they need with their bosses or with the teachers or with their fellow students or workers. And right now, businesses and also like training institution at vocational and tertiary education level are having problem with bringing in these extra soft skills to the new entrants, you know. And I do think that schools can bring more this kind of soft skills to the students so that they will be ready to adapt themselves to the changes in like the learning environment in vocational school or in universities or in the businesses. But the thing is, businesses and universities can come back to schools and help them with delivering this the soft skills to the students because the current school curriculum didn't have those things or didn't have enough, you know. So, and I would think of like if we can do a cooperative studies on how these things are being done in Japan and Vietnam is very nice, you know. And I have to tell you, my doctor degree is from Hirodai, so I am also somehow also Japanese flavored, you know. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. I want to give everyone just one last quick comment, or at least Dr. Anderson-Levitt, a last quick comment.
Well, thank you. I'm sorry I don't have time to respond more to some of the questions that you have raised, but they're very stimulating, and clearly we need to continue to pay a lot of attention to the implementation level, as the prior panel said, right? There's and differences cross-national, as you pointed out, but even you noticed the presence of the World Bank and OECD in both Uruguay and Russia to some extent, but France also was influenced by the European Union. They influenced the European Union, and then the European Union came back and has been pushing heavily the competencies. So it's curious to me. And Dr. Sasaki, I want to talk to you later about the field work you did in France. So I want to learn more about your research, but I think we need to let people go to lunch, but maybe we can discuss further in whatever kind of system we have for sharing chats and comments. So thank you very much again.
All right. Well, in the interest of lunch and people's energy, perhaps we should call the session to a close. Thank you for your patience, and thank you, Dr. Anderson-Levitt, Dr. Kitamura, Dr. Sasaki, and Dr. Fong. Thank you for your insights, and a lot to mine here. I wish we had time to do it, but I think we have to honor the law of lunch.
Thank you.
So that brings us to the end of our morning session. So please allow me to remind that please use the same link as the morning session to attend the conference afternoon session. And now let's have a break, and we will see you at 2 p.m. Vietnam time. Yes, thank you.
In 2 hours.